Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. This week we're going to be talking about nonviolent communication. So I've been studying it a little bit myself for the past couple of weeks and very intrigued. I find it really resonates with so much of what we talk about. At the most basic level, it's kind of just a framework for communication that helps people move through differences, issues. And kind of at almost a higher level, it's almost like a philosophy for life in general. It parallels a lot as far as like what we talked about, Carl Rogers, and honestly, it parallels a lot of different approaches, a lot of different philosophies that we've talked about before. So yeah, that's kind of high level understanding. How about you, Nick? What have you learned about nonviolent communication?
Yeah, so I learned that it's a great tool for resolving conflicts, basically, or to be able to communicate better when you need to have a difficult conversation, let's say. It's a good thing to keep in mind. And I know that there's this framework of, how many was it? 4 steps that need to be included in your communication. And perhaps we could lay them out a little bit, so to have just a base understanding of like what does it actually mean, like what are the 4 steps that need to be included in communication. So yeah, I don't have very deep knowledge of it, but I did a workshop about nonviolent communication, and then afterwards try to kind of apply it also to my communication, especially when giving feedback, trying to get across a difficult message. I think it helps. I think it helps with how people receive it. So my experience is definitely positive. But yeah, maybe let's use the chance to really try to deep dive and understand why it is effective as well. I think that would be pretty cool. So do you want to lay out the 4 parts or 4 steps?
Yeah, sure. I actually had to Google it because I didn't realize it was broken down that way. But from what I'm reading right now, the first thing is you're just sharing observations. And it's really important that these observations are really just based in fact and aren't interpretations. This is one of the main areas where I find nonviolent communication so effective, is because it really causes you to examine your language. We have this tendency of kind of projecting onto the conversation our interpretations. Like, you did this thing and it was wrong. There's so much in even that statement that is really a judgment. Whereas it could be like, okay, you raised your voice at me, or even that can maybe even be seen as like a bit of a judgment, or like your voice got louder than usual or something. It's probably about as factual as you can make it. So that's the first step, just only communicating with observations. Then the second step is around sharing your feelings. And again, here it's really important not to like be blaming the other person or interpreting. So generally, the way that I've understood it is you kind of stick to very, very basic feelings rather than something that's complex. So for example, to say something like, I feel abandoned, very complex, and it involves like a lot of kind of interpretation in it. Whereas if you say something like, I feel sad, very, very basic, straightforward. It doesn't have to be blamed on anything, which is really an important point, because when people feel blamed for how you feel, then they tend to get really defensive. Then the third step is around communicating your needs. And again, you kind of have to do it very objectively. So for example, just saying something like, I need safety, right? Rather than using a strategy, right? So Marshall Rosenberg, the guy that kind of came up with nonviolent communication, one of the things that he kind of creates a distinction around is needs and strategies to getting those needs met. So a strategy is like what you're actually doing to get that need met. Whereas if you just communicate the need, the underlying need itself, without saying how it needs to get met, it kind of opens things up in the conversation. Basically, you're communicating to the other person that I need this thing, but I don't necessarily know how that need needs to get met. I have an idea. And this is another place where I find it really effective, because we do have like very concrete ideas of how our needs need to get met, right? And that can really that can make things challenging, because sometimes the strategy that you know of to get your need met might not meet the other person's needs. So if you can both communicate like in a very objective way about your need, then you can kind of come to this compromise of like, okay, well, I can help you meet that need in this way, but I can't do it in the way that you're asking me to do it. Then the final step is what they call requests, which is basically kind of framing, kind of putting it all together and asking the other person for something, a way, potentially to meet your need. For me, the main things about this strategy is really around like the objectivity, around the observations, around not blaming your feelings, and around stating needs without stating the strategy. So that's kind of, I think I touched on all four. I had to Google it to find them, but that's my basic understanding.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if Rosenberg intended it that way, but how I learned it in that workshop was that you could actually frame a written message that way. So you could really,
Sure.
You could have basically at least one sentence per step, let's say, and somebody reading that message, is actually likely to receive it in a positive way, let's say. And yeah, maybe let's try to understand like what is the reason why that is. I think you laid it out great, especially for the needs. For the feelings part, I would add maybe one thing. So you mentioned we shouldn't communicate like complex emotions, rather, go for simple, understandable ones. And maybe the first step there is, and you already did that. I'm not sure if you did it like intuitively or because you're just reading into this framework. You said, I feel, and then you mentioned the feeling. And that's already pretty good, because what we usually do is we say I and then the feeling. So you usually maybe you say to somebody, I am disappointed. And that's not a good way of communicating it, because it's not even good for you, because that means that you're identifying with that feeling.
Yeah.
So, and also for the other person, then it's kind of a mixed signal, because they can't really do anything about you, but they can do something about your feelings, or they can understand your feelings. So it's good for you as a communicator, because you make this clear separation of I just feel that feeling. So that's something that can go away. And in general, it is a good way to always state your feelings, because that's something that nobody can talk you out of, right? It's not an observation or a fact where we could argue, right? If you have a conflict with somebody, then this thing happened, and there's two perspectives on the thing, and you could argue forever about that. But if you approach somebody and just share your feelings, that's not something they can talk you out of. If you say, I feel disappointed, it's like, okay, they have to acknowledge that. So I think it's a good way to lay out the problem of the situation. So it's great that they have it as a step in there. Yeah, and then about the first step, about observation, perhaps the hardest one, because the aim here is to state whatever you observe without judgments or even evaluation. As simple as that sounds, that's insanely difficult, actually. I don't know if you ever try to or try to reflect your own speech and then understand like what is a judgment, what is an evaluation. And I know there's people who like religiously do this and who swear by it, that in general we shouldn't evaluate or judge in communication. So for example, a teacher at my school, he takes this really seriously, and he's often gonna say, I don't know, a sentence, and mid-sentence he's gonna realize, wait, there was an evaluation. I shouldn't say it like that. And he kind of like rephrases his language.
Mhm.
And it's kind of a cool thing to see because even if you have like years of practice, it's just default for us to, be evaluating and judging our environment because I guess that's part of the default mode. So yeah, I don't know. What's your experience with that? Do you find it difficult to, come out of this evaluation and judgment perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where this framework kind of almost turns into a philosophy,
Right.
right? Where essentially you're taking it almost to like an extreme, and and I don't say that, I don't mean that in like a bad way whatsoever. It's something that you kind of aspire towards, right? It's not something that you're ever necessarily going to get 100%, but it's kind of like an orientation, or like what Yogananda might call a pole star, something to kind of orient yourself towards, right? So I find it extremely powerful in that regard. And yeah, I totally agree. It is very, very challenging to do that, and to just start to examine your language and notice how much you're like constantly evaluating and judging. And I think it's really cool that you have a teacher that really tries to embody this. Right? Like that's where it really does become like more of a life philosophy, and it can really be life changing in that regard, because it really does start to change the way that you see the world, the way that you evaluate the world. One of the things that Marshall Rosenberg talks about a lot that I really appreciate is he uses this phrase as seeing other people's like behavior, especially if it's something that kind of troubles you, seeing it as a tragic expression of an unmet need is the phrase that he uses. So basically, he's got a little song that he does. He's got actually a number of songs that he does, which are really endearing, I find. But this one song that he does, he starts it off with, this is what the children are actually saying to you when they say no, or when the other person says, the problem with you is, and what they're actually saying underneath that, according to the song, is see me beautiful, which essentially, I think I probably shared this on the last podcast actually, but really kind of what we're all looking for is to just be seen and accepted as we are. And sometimes the way that we're expressing that, it really doesn't seem that way, right? So it can really shift the way that you view other people's behavior. And yeah, I mean, it can really help a lot of empathy and compassion arise within you if you can start to view what's going on in other people as essentially, sometimes a tragic expression of an unmet need, something that they're not in touch with themselves about. And personally, another aspect I find really powerful is I try to also apply this within myself, right? With like the way that I communicate to myself internally, because I think that that's another place where we can really struggle, and we can really have like, pretty detrimental judgments of ourselves, and to try to reframe that. Like if you're doing something, if you have some habits that you really don't like and you want to try to change them, what if you saw those habits as expressions of unmet needs? And instead of beating yourself up about it, you're like, okay, there's information here. There's something that I can work with here. What is the underlying need that isn't really getting met? And seeing it as something, again, kind of simple, like maybe safety. And then examining, are there other ways that I can get this need met? Are there other strategies that I can use? Because right now the strategy of beating myself up in my head is not very effective.
Mm-hmm. The step of, expressing the unmet need, I would say, is really non-trivial because
Yeah.
so it's not just that you're reframing how you communicate. You actually need to do some work in order to be able to communicate to somebody like what is the unmet need. So it starts usually, everybody knows how it goes in conflict. We get emotional. Yeah, and we communicate, like you said, almost in a tragic way, definitely not in a skilled way. And then the step before you could even communicate this properly would be to even understand for yourself. So you maybe you already realize the feeling that has been caused, but you really need some reflection in order to understand what is causing the emotion or the feeling. and it's an unmet need, right? But in that process, you've done part of the conflict resolution basically, because once you've done that, then you're like, oh, okay, I just feel not included. I just feel whatever the need is that is this underlying, it gives you clarity in why your feelings are hurt perhaps in the situation, and now you're able to communicate that. And
Yeah.
that's kind of half of the deal already there, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the places that we go astray in conversations that turn into arguments and stuff is by not even really understanding what's going on within us, right? Like why did what the other person said bother you? And using this framework, what unmet need did it kind of like violate, or, did it go against one of your strategies? And being able to articulate that clearly and objectively, again, kind of referencing Marshall Rosenberg, he says that it's a gift to other people, right? To be able to tell them what you need in this way, using this framework, right? Of not blaming, of not judging, and just very clearly and plainly stating that, because people enjoy helping you meet your needs in that regard, right? When you're not imposing, like, I need this exact, I need this strategy to get this need met. I just need, connection. I just need to feel safe. Things like that, right? And even that, right? Even saying something like, I need to feel safe, right? There's a little bit of interpretation in there. Like, okay, there's a little bit of potential strategy kind of hiding. So this system, I find that it's so effective, but it is also just like a perpetual challenge to really get at the kind of underlying objective, I guess you could say, truth of what's going on.
Yeah. Another important aspect which seems to contribute here is, and this is a quote I remember from this workshop, so I don't know if it comes from Rosenberg or not, but it was something along the lines like vulnerability resolves conflict.
Hmm.
And I find that quite wise, because it's kind of true. Because if you have a conflict with somebody and they approach you with being vulnerable, I mean, you can't really go against that. It's really difficult to go against that. If somebody opens up and becomes vulnerable in front of you, it, assuming that every person has the capacity for compassion, it's going to toggle compassion basically in the other person. And the conflict needs to be very hard for other people not to respond positively to you being vulnerable, basically.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. Vulnerability is so powerful, but again, it's another one of these things that's so challenging to do authentically. One of the traps with so much of what we talk about, and certainly nonviolent communication, is the framework ends up kind of becoming a strategy itself for you to accomplish something, right? So to kind of invite in another framework that we've mentioned before, there's this one from the Art of Accomplishment folks called the VIEW framework, and the first part of that is vulnerability, and impartiality, empathy, and wonder. And I find that those really kind of pair well with the nonviolent communication framework, because in order to get these things to be effective, you really have to be authentic. You have to be genuine in the way that you're employing it, right? So when it comes to something like vulnerability, that can very easily turn into a strategy to try and manipulate the other person, right? And at that point, it seems like it no longer works. It's almost kind of magical how these things work when you're like really in it, when you're really authentic about it. But it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy when you're not genuine, when you're really trying to use it as like a manipulation strategy, which all of these things can kind of become that. Kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, vulnerability elicits emotion in the person communicating it, right? You're putting yourself out there and you're sharing an emotion, and it's going to basically elicit that emotion. And I think if you're communicating with somebody directly, they're just going to feel whether or not that resonates, whether or not that is true, whether or
Yeah.
not that is authentic. So Yeah, it's really hard to fake. I totally believe it. I think we can, tell apart if somebody's trying to fake something like that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think one of the ways, so of course, with that caveat of needing to be authentic, then the question kind of becomes, well, how do I do that? Right? Which I think that's a really difficult question to answer. So I'd kind of just throw it right back to you. Like,
Hmm.
okay, knowing that we need to be authentic, how do we be authentic?
Yeah, you need to maybe specify it a bit more, just in general, or
Sure.
like in this kind of scenario, or how do you mean that?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's helpful to add a few more constraints around it. So yeah, let's see. So yeah, like in this type of situation, so your feelings have been hurt kind of by something that someone else said, and you want to really communicate that vulnerably, and you want it to come across, you want to be authentic in the way that you're doing that. Is there, I guess maybe, are there any particular indicators of whether or not you're being authentic? And if you notice yourself not being authentic, what can you do to move yourself towards like more authenticity? I know, challenging
Mm,
question. So
it is indeed. I don't necessarily maybe have a strategy, but my reflection on that is that in general, I think if you have a conflict with a person that you care about, what you're seeking ultimately is connection with them.
yeah,
And the only way to truly connect with people is if you also show yourself authentically. So I think often we are misguided and often we try to put a mask on in social situations, try to impress people and so on, but ultimately it doesn't lead to connection. So I think, maybe this framework works also if you're masking with people, but it's not gonna bring you back that connection. So if the goal is connection, the only way is to be authentic. And yeah, it takes courage to be vulnerable, basically. I think this is kind of the key message of Brene Brown. I don't know if you ever read anything from her or like seen her
yep,
TED Talks.
yeah,
She talks big time about this, and that's why I love her stuff also so much. But I think from her work, I kind of derived this. She always says you need to be vulnerable, but I have the feeling what she's saying is you have to be courageous, basically,
mm,
because it takes that step out of comfort, I guess, in order to be vulnerable. But it's the only way. If you're seeking true connection, if you're not doing that, you're gonna end up in relationships that work for whatever mask you're putting on, but they're not gonna
yeah,
feel satisfactory in the long run. So it's for me really pointless to communicate in that way. So long-winded answer, I guess, to me trying to summarize it would be I don't necessarily have a specific strategy, but I could remind myself that okay, what am I seeking here? I
mm,
like this person. I want to reconnect with this person. So the only way to do is to honestly think about okay, what is the needs that have been crossed here, and honestly communicate them. The best way you can do it. Maybe not
yeah,
reflected enough to even understand what is the truly underlying need, but you give it your best shot, basically.
yeah. I love that answer. It touches on so many important points. I mean, you mentioned connection, and I find that to be very true as well. Like, kind of in a lot of ways, what we are seeking in relationship is connection, is kind of almost like a feeling of camaraderie, or of kind of just both being there, both witnessing the situation. And I also like, it's funny, I like that you struggle to come up with a strategy, because
Hmm.
in a way, I feel like any strategy kind of like is a diversion from authenticity. I mean, if you're showing
Right.
up and you have a strategy, it's like you're not being authentic. Those are kind of antithetical. So it was almost, in a way, now that I'm kind of reflecting on it, it was almost like a trick question, right? But yeah, I really agree with so much of what you said. You just kind of communicating your present truth. I mean, it has a lot of, there's kind of like a flavor of meditation in there to it, right? And being authentic. It's like you have to be kind of present and be honest and kind of vulnerable and open with what's going on with you at that moment, right? And of course, there are different levels of sharing what's going on with you, because I know that just that idea of sharing vulnerably what's happening can be like very scary, can be very challenging, right? Because for a lot of us, for myself certainly included, I think there's a fear of rejection, right? I think that's one of the things that, so this is starting to put me on another tangent, maybe a useful one, but maybe one helpful way to look at it is, what are the obstacles to authenticity, right? What are the things that prevent us from actually being authentic in any given moment? And one thing that's coming to mind here is like the fear of rejection, right? And that's something that I think, for a lot of folks, for myself certainly included, develops in childhood, where maybe as a child, you almost don't have strategies. You're almost kind of, certainly the younger you are, the more authentic you tend to be. You don't really have those masks. And so when you're showing up authentically, sometimes you might learn, you might be rejected. And that kind of might teach you that it's dangerous to show up authentically. Right. And so that's one of the obstacles that I see. I'm curious, as I start to kind of take us in that direction of obstacles, do any obstacles come to mind for you? Or?
Yeah, I mean, my personal obstacles have been and are similar. So I think it's some form of rejection that we experience perhaps in early childhood. Another one that comes to mind is that this is just, I think, a strategy that many people that are empath employ, because you basically have the skill of feeling into people, connecting with people empathetically, and it can become a misguided strategy of following basically whatever unmet needs are in the room, are with other people, and trying to satisfy them. So you become this kind of people pleasing person. And for me personally, this worked as a strategy, like since childhood. But what that means basically is that you need to abandon your own needs. So in my case, it even led to basically not knowing my own needs. So I was leaning into that so far that I think I am very skilled at reading the room. I think I'm really skilled at immediately understanding what people's emotions are, even going like one step further of like, okay, what's the need there? And immediately jumping on, okay, how can I serve this person at this moment and change their mood? And in the process, completely abandoning self-reflection of what is actually my own need, what is actually my state right now, not having boundaries for myself, because you make yourself dependent on other people for validation, for feeling safe, for feeling good, and so on. So you don't even take the time of reflecting, how am I feeling right now? Yeah, and I lost another point related to that, but yeah, I guess it can develop in a direction of you, since you are not really authentically showing up, instead you're always reading other people, it leads you to basically build masks and personas for different situations, for different people, for different groups. And it's so much wasted effort, basically, I think. I mean, I guess we cannot be authentic in every situation, right? I mean, there's just some official situations that require us to take on a role and, fulfill those. But I think the objection should be to authentically show up in that role. But yeah, that has been very, very difficult for me. And I'm basically in the process of undoing that, of trying to, understand for myself, like, is this the mask that I created, or is this authentically me? And it's a really, well, long process as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy, I can totally relate to that. One of the things, as I've gotten more and more into nonviolent communication, I've found it really valuable to even kind of take a look at what my needs are. I mean, especially as, and just speaking from my experience as a guy, we're almost kind of culturally conditioned to not have needs or to not really be aware of our needs, right? It's almost like you're just trying to, you know, take care of everyone else around you in a sense, right? I'm sure that could easily be misinterpreted, but not really examining and expressing our own needs. So yeah, just getting into this framework and trying to see like, okay, what's the underlying need behind what I'm going through with what I'm feeling has been really challenging, but also like really liberating and really valuable. So I've tried applying the framework a little bit in my relationship, and I would say so far, somewhat mixed results, right?
Hmm.
Like I find it's very difficult for me to kind of get to a point where I'm doing it authentically and I'm not using it as a strategy. Because I think initially, as you're learning a new system, sort of like this, initially it's almost guaranteed that it's going to kind of be a strategy, just because you don't know how to do it, and it's not like natural, right? So you're noticing your normal judgments and thoughts come up, and you're like, no, 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 not that, not that, right? And sometimes I find myself just not even knowing what to say, because I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go back to my old kind of programming and communicate with judgments and stuff. But I don't know what else to say, and so sometimes it just kind of is sitting there, so I'll ask ChatGPT or something like, using nonviolent communication, how would you respond to this? But honestly, it can be kind of helpful, if nothing else, to kind of give you some ideas and give you a sense of what it might look like. And also watching some of Marshall Rosenberg's videos I've found to be pretty useful. Sometimes he describes the arguments that people have and how he helps them navigate through it. I've found those to be pretty fun. Really enjoy Marshall Rosenberg.
At what step do you feel like you get stuck? If you say you come to a situation where sometimes you don't even know what to say, like which part of the four ones gives you trouble?
Yeah, good question. Honestly, since I haven't followed it that formulaically, a lot of times the place where I find it challenging is if someone's communicating like something that they're uncomfortable with, like say that they have pain or something, say that they have a headache and they're communicating something like that. Sometimes I can find it challenging to, so I guess, thinking through it, I feel like I can, observation is, not too challenging. Okay, so it sounds like you're in pain or something right now, right? Then maybe even inferring some feeling or guessing at, right? That's kind of part of step two around the feelings. If you're communicating with someone and trying to empathize with them, you might just guess at how they're feeling, and sometimes, your guess is totally off base, which almost kind of invites the other person to correct it, I find. But sometimes the other person just kind of like stops engaging a little bit, or they don't totally play what seems like a game. So I guess I kind of sometimes fizzle out around like, okay, so pretend someone's coming to me, they have a headache or something. I'm like, okay, I noticed that you have a headache. Maybe you're feeling like a little bit sad or something. And if that's just totally doesn't land with them one way or the other, it doesn't push them one way or the other, they might just kind of stop engaging at that point. And it's like, okay, now what do I do? And I guess, as I'm talking through it, sometimes the strategy is to just listen and just kind of be there, right? In a way, one of the things that Marshall Rosenberg says is that you don't necessarily have to be explicit with these steps, right? Like you don't necessarily have to express, oh, you might be feeling, or I think you might be feeling, or even take guesses. You don't necessarily have to do that, but that can kind of be an internal thing, and telling yourself, oh, this person might be feeling really sad because they've been struggling with headaches a lot recently or something, right? But when it kind of deviates from the formulaic part, I think is where I kind of get a little bit tripped up. I don't know
Hmm.
if I answered your question very well at all.
No, I think I understand it better now. Do you want to maybe go through an example, like to maybe we both can like think how something could be communicated to try to, see if we understand the framework correctly, let's say. And this example came to my mind. Don't ask me why, but let's take it because I think it's kind of fun. It's a difficult one. It's one thing I always avoided to communicate. So imagine this: you have a stinky coworker.
Okay, sure.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
Once in your life, you had this person with really bad body odor and nobody told them. And it's becoming a problem. It's at work. And, they're sitting in a cubicle, like 2 cubicles down. And, your coworkers and you are eyeing each other and like, oh my God, this is terrible. Somebody needs to tell this person. So you take up the courageous task of sitting that person down in a one-on-one. And now you need to tell them, hopefully in a non-violent way, what your request is. So yeah, giving you the challenge now. How would you lay that out?
Yeah, I really love this example. It's got a little bit of humor. Yeah, and it's very challenging. I've been in this situation before, and I was very young and did not handle it very well. I was kind of mean to the person. So, yeah. Okay, so you're sitting someone down. You want to start with like an observation and have it not be a judgment. Boy, even coming up with an observation here is pretty challenging. I guess it might be something like, I notice that you have a very strong, boy, even that is, I'm noticing judgment in almost
Yeah,
everything I come up
it's
with.
hard, I know.
There's, you know, boy, in every way I want to put it, there is a little bit of judgment, and sometimes it's a little bit humorous, but that may not necessarily land well. Like, oh, you have a very lovely perfume about you, or right? I mean, there's so much judgment, and let's see. I guess I could kind of try and turn it around and like, okay, maybe I had bad body odor, and how would I want someone to tell me about that? I guess the observation might be not necessarily about the person themselves or, their body odor. Maybe it's about how other people respond to it. Like, hey, I've noticed a lot of people around are kind of put off a little bit by, this body odor. Boy, even that one feels really hard to say. So maybe sometimes that's a good guide for what you should say, for what's authentic, is sometimes the hardest thing to say. Like the, oh my God, am I actually going to say this? So yeah, maybe it's, hey, like I care about you. You're my coworker, and a lot of other folks, myself included, can be a little bit put off by your body odor. That's very real, very alive. I guess starting there might work. Okay, and then going to the next step with a feeling. I know that might make you feel like really embarrassed, or it might be really challenging to hear that. And then maybe going with a need. Let's see. So I know that we all have like a need to kind of like fit in and be accepted. And I kind of have a need for my friends and the people that I, care about to feel accepted as well. And so then maybe a request, right? Completing this. Or, maybe you stop at any of these points just to see how they respond. If they look like they're totally pissed off at you or something, maybe you back off or just see, kind of check in with them. But if I were to proceed with a request or something, I'd be like, maybe they would, boy, even this part feels really challenging. But yeah, maybe if you wanted to try out some deodorant or something, I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
I think you did really great, honestly, because I don't have, I haven't even thought this through. I don't have a good solution for it. I think you did pretty well. I think one observation of mine is we can't probably get around communicating really the problem.
Yeah.
So I think you did a good job of not putting judgments, but we have to say basically like you're smelling, and I think people are noticing, or it is bothering me. Your smell is bothering me. It is difficult to focus for me when you're sitting next to me, or you're putting me in a difficult situation because I know that everybody's aware, but nobody's communicating. I think in conflict, we do have to say the uncomfortable thing, the thing that where we feel this is going to hurt the other person, because if it did really, break one of our needs, I don't even know what the need in this case would be. I guess be working autonomously or being focused, or I mean, basically, if somebody smells bad, it's kind of crossing your personal space as well, right? So your
Yeah.
personal boundary is kind of violated. So maybe that's like one of the needs that has been crossed there. And yeah, I guess maybe in the request, perhaps we don't need to. Maybe we don't need to recommend like what is the solution, like what we discussed before. So maybe we don't need to like
Yeah.
request you need to use deodorant or you need to shower more, or maybe we can just request, can you be mindful of the fact that we work together in this environment whenever you come to work. I think that would be great. Something like that probably. But yeah, no, I love this because this is such a hard request, because we know it's a vulnerable topic. Like nobody wants to smell bad, nobody wants to be in a situation where you sat down and somebody says it to you and you don't want to tell it to people. For some reason it's really uncomfortable, but I think it was a great example of like breaking down the basics.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's kind of like a pretty reasonable one. It's something that we probably all experienced, and it's also like a very challenging one. And I mean, honestly, I think if you are able to communicate with the person like in a very kind of genuine way, that they'd actually be thankful and appreciative. Like if they didn't know this and people were, maybe treating them differently or something because of this body odor or whatever, then they might actually be really thankful. Like, oh yeah, I really appreciate that someone told me, I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. I live in this all the time, so I don't notice it, right? So yeah, I think in a way it can be kind of like the more compassionate thing to do to sometimes bring up the more difficult things to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically you're reflecting perhaps a blind spot back to somebody. Like maybe somebody is really not aware, and this is just one of the examples. But honestly, I'm really happy if I get like, yeah, quote unquote negative feedback. And whenever, for example, at my workplace, when we have these evaluations once a year, we receive like feedback, sometimes anonymous feedback. Honestly, I always hope for something negative, constructive, or whatever,
Right.
because the good comments, it's great, boost your ego, you
Sure.
get something nice reflected back. But the other ones, especially if it's like anonymous, that's cool stuff, because now I'm getting something reflected back which I'm not paying attention to at all. And it can
Yeah.
still be that it's just a projection, or somebody else's parts projecting onto me. But at least it's an opportunity to get some honest feedback of something you have not seen. And then if somebody does it like using nonviolent communication, that would be like the perfect scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I agree. I've been in work environments myself where not specifically nonviolent communication, but there is like certain framing around how you give feedback, how you give constructive feedback, and how you receive feedback. And I've found it to be, certainly very in alignment with all of this, but also just like you're saying, really, really valuable, especially if you can receive it, regardless of how it's being articulated. If you can receive it well, then it really is a gift. I mean, it gives you an opportunity to change in a positive direction, right? And so often, as you were saying, we're really not aware of those blind spots. It's, I mean, totally transparent to us. It's not even like necessarily a dimension of existence that we consider.
Yeah, agree. Do you feel this is a well roundup, or was there more tangents you wanted to open where you feel it would be
Hmm.
nice to mention?
Yeah, I guess if I were to kind of try and wrap it up a little bit, I'd say that nonviolent communication at the most basic level, it's kind of a framework for how to communicate with people with kind of rules and arguably strategies around how to do that. And the more that you can actually embody it, it kind of becomes more of like a life philosophy. It kind of transcends just rules because ultimately, I think with so many things, I mean, any practices that we do, eventually you kind of have to drop the rules.
Hmm. I agree. Honestly, thanks for bringing up this topic. It wasn't on my radar anymore, and I love the fact that we could use it to become more empathetic listeners, be more aware of our needs, and especially the part of judgment and evaluation. I feel it's a nice reminder to start thinking about that in our communication, and yeah, maybe not try to filter ourselves, but at least recognize where
Yeah.
our thinking goes into, okay, this is a judgment, and yeah, seeing things without judgment, I think is an interesting experience. So yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, if anyone listening, if you've practiced nonviolent communication or anything, love to hear about it. If we got anything wrong, would also love to hear that. Or if you have any suggestions for something you'd like to hear us talk about in the future.
Yeah, sure, but please communicate it to us in a non-violent way.